On the 19th of September 1978, a 13-year-old paperboy, Carl Bridgewater, was shot in the head at close range at Yew Tree Farm near Stourbridge, England. 4 men would be convicted and jailed for the brutal murder, but the case would remain in the news for years and would play a large role in the eventual disbanding of the infamously corrupt West Midlands Serious Crime Squad. The murder of such a young and innocent person shocked the UK, where an outrage of that magnitude rarely occurred, then and now. Police theorised that young Carl had disturbed a robbery in progress before being dragged into the living room of the house and killed by a shotgun blast. The occupants of the house, an elderly couple named Mary Poole and Fred Jones, were not at home at the time. They were disabled, and Carl would let himself in through the back door every day to deliver their paper. As in all such cases, public pressure on the police to make an arrest was huge. Later in 1978, a spate of armed robberies in the West Midlands drew police toward a group of criminals in the area. On the 24th of November, 2 men later identified as James Robinson and Vincent Hickey robbed a Tesco supermarket on the Castlevale estate in Birmingham. Robinson and Hickey hit the safe, while a third man, who was never brought to justice, held terrified shoppers at bay. When the store manager tried to intervene, a shotgun blast was fired over his head. Less than a week later, Robinson and Hickey robbed an elderly couple at Chapel Farm near Halesowen, while Vincent's 18-year-old cousin, Michael, waited in the car. During the crime, one of the victims was hit with a shotgun, though the weapon was not discharged. Police had by now zeroed in on the robbers as the probable killers of Carl Bridgewater. A confederate of the 3 aforementioned men, Patrick Malloy, was the first person to be arrested. After intensive questioning about the robberies and the Bridgewater murder, a confession was elicited. Malloy's admission claimed that he had been in an upstairs bedroom at Yew Tree Farm, carrying out the robbery, when he had heard a gunshot from downstairs. This was good enough for the police. The law has since been changed following a number of miscarriages of justice to prohibit conviction by confession alone, unless that confession is corroborated by other evidence or accompanied by a guilty plea. Robinson and the Hickeys were arrested soon after, despite firmly denying any involvement in the murder and the attempted robbery. Robinson and the Hickeys were convicted on the 9th of November 1979. Malloy was convicted of manslaughter. Robinson, then 45, and Michael Hickey, 25, received a life sentence with a recommended tariff of 25 years. Due to his age, he was 17 at the time of the crime, Michael Hickey was detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, with the anticipation that he would serve a relatively short sentence. Malloy, who was 51 at the time, received a 12-year term, but would die in jail of a heart attack just 2 years later. Almost as soon as the men were sent down, a campaign to free them began, led by Michael Hickey's mother, Anne Whelan, and the campaigning journalist Paul Foote. Police had no conclusive evidence against the men, other than Malloy's confession. A first appeal in 1981, heard by Lord Lane, affirmed the conviction, Lane dismissing talk of another credible suspect as, quote, a red herring. A further appeal in March 1989 was rejected. In 1993, James Robinson spent 82 days on the roof of Gartree Prison, Leicestershire, in an effort to highlight his plight. Not only his innocence, but to raise awareness that the men were being targeted for attack in prison, since other prisoners reserved particular venom for child killers. This followed earlier lengthy rooftop protests by the Hickeys in 1983 and 1984. Then, on the 21st of February 1997, the Court of Appeal ruled that the men's convictions should be overturned. Evidence had come to light that Malloy's confession had been influenced by fabricated evidence created by the police. It is important to note that an overturning of conviction is not the same as being declared innocent, and the appeal court judges noted that there was sufficient evidence for the Crown to consider a retrial of Vincent Hickey, but the Crown Prosecution Service declined to proceed. The Home Office did, however, deduct a quarter of the compensation amount received by the Hickeys for the cost of keeping them in prison. This was a sizable sum, since Vincent was awarded £500,000 and Michael £990,000. Whilst the four men weren't declared innocent, if they didn't do it, who did? There was one other major suspect. For years, speculation in the media has pointed the finger at a convicted murderer, Bert Spencer. Spencer had been considered by the police at the time, but as so often in less sophisticated eras of policing, once they'd zeroed in on the Bridgewater Four, he was eliminated. A few months later, Spencer murdered 70-year-old Hubert Wilkes at Holloway Farm, which neighboured Yew Tree Farm, a crime for which he served 15 years. The MO, including the victim receiving a shotgun blast while seated on a sofa, was identical. That was far from the only thing which brought scrutiny on Spencer. He drove a blue Vauxhall Viva, the same model as a suspicious car that was seen in the area of Yew Tree Farm that day. Crucially, he knew Carl Bridgewater, and Bridgewater knew him. They lived 5 doors apart, and the obvious motive for murder was there, that Carl could have identified him. The Bridgewater Four, whilst violent, hadn't shot anybody, even when members of the public resisted them. Spencer also held a shotgun license and shot regularly at Yew Tree Farm. In 2016, Channel 4 screened a documentary entitled Interview with a Murderer, in which well-known criminologist David Wilson spoke with Spencer and his family. Spencer's daughter felt that he may have been at the scene that day, while his former wife said that he had disposed of his shotgun the day after the murder. Spencer worked as an ambulance driver at the time of the killing. The documentary spoke to a co-worker at the same ambulance station, who in 1978 had given him what seemed a cast-iron alibi, and now said that she couldn't be sure he hadn't left work that day. The documentary also spoke at length to Spencer himself, who naturally protested his innocence. Wilson concluded from speaking with him that he was a callous and manipulative psychopath. Vincent Hickey has continuously called for the case to be reopened, not only to vindicate himself, but to get justice for Carl Bridgewater and his family. In public comments, Carl's parents, Brian and Janet Bridgewater, have maintained that the guilty men were convicted and jailed. Robinson died of lung cancer in 2007. The case remains unsolved, and is never likely to be solved. The Bridgewater Four were definitely fitted up by the police, which is not the same as saying they were definitely not guilty. However, that malfeasance by officers turned them away from a far more interesting suspect. The Bridgewater Four were the victims of a miscarriage of justice, which was to some degree remediated, though nothing can make up for lost years. Carl Bridgewater and his family, whom we know for certain were truly innocent, will probably never know any form of justice at all.